The flight. Jose's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest as the wheels of his car tore across the asphalt. His mind was a chaotic swirl of confusion and fear, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with every passing second. The road stretched ahead, dark and narrow, winding through unfamiliar terrain, and Jose pushed the pedal to the floor, desperate to outrun the nightmare that had unfolded only moments before. The engine of his car roared in protest as it surged forward, tires gripping the pavement with a shriek. His eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, watching the flashing red and blue lights grow ever closer. They were closing in on him, and the sense of impending doom was suffocating. Jose had been running before. He had grown up in a world where the rules weren't the same for him as they were for others. The color of his skin had always made him a target, by the police, by strangers, by society at large. He had learned early on that he had to fight for his place in the world, to prove that he was worth more than the assumptions made about him. But this was different. This wasn't just about his race or the prejudice he faced. This was about survival. His mind replayed the scene that had pushed him to this point. The murder, the man, the victim. Jose had witnessed it all, but he couldn't explain why the murderer was so familiar. He had seen the man before, in the quiet corners of his neighborhood, always watching, always lurking, but never speaking. And then, one night, Jose had witnessed him in the act. Cold, calculated, ruthless. The man had no regard for life. The way he'd stood over his victim, smirking as he silenced their cries, it had haunted Jose, eating away at him with a sense of urgency and terror that he couldn't shake. His mind raced. The police weren't the solution. They never were, not for him. But what if this time was different? What if he could convince them? He didn't have time to waste on what-ifs. All he knew was that he had to run, to get away before the law caught up with him. The fear of being arrested for something he hadn't done, the fear of being trapped in a system that never cared, drove him forward. As the sirens wailed louder, the reality of his situation set in. He was in over his head. If he was caught, he could kiss his freedom goodbye. Worse yet, if they believed the officer, if they believed that he was the one in those photos, that he was somehow connected to the twisted images of children, they would never listen to his side. He would be a ghost, lost to the injustice of a world that was already determined to make him guilty before hearing him out. His foot slammed harder on the accelerator, and the car shot forward with renewed speed. He had to get away. He had to make them see the truth. But deep down, Jose knew he was running out of options. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the flashing lights of a patrol car. He glanced over his shoulder again, and there it was, a shadow in the darkness. The officer, Jed, was still following him. Jed's vehicle was closing in on him, and the closer he got, the more the weight of Jose's actions pressed on him. He couldn't outrun the truth, and yet he was trying to do just that. The night felt like it was closing in around him, suffocating him with each passing second. Jose's grip tightened on the steering wheel, as if holding on to the last threads of sanity. His mind felt like it was slipping away, the adrenaline coursing through his body like a drug. He needed to think, to focus, but it was getting harder to concentrate. The world outside was a blur of dark shapes and flashing lights, and he could feel the pull of panic threatening to swallow him whole. Suddenly, the sound of sirens intensified, and the vehicle behind him was right on his tail. Jose's hands tightened even more, and he jerked the wheel to the side, cutting a sharp turn onto a side road. The tires screeched in protest as the car veered dangerously, but Jose didn't care. He had to keep moving. He had to get away. The pursuit continued, and Jose's thoughts spiraled. His breaths were shallow, his vision blurred from the panic that clung to him like a second skin. He had never felt so powerless, so completely out of control. His foot continued to press down on the gas, but deep inside, he knew this couldn't last forever. He was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. A part of him wondered if Jed would stop, if the officer would see reason, Maybe he could explain. Maybe there was a chance that Jed would listen to his story. But as the seconds ticked by, Jose realized that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Another turn. Another sharp corner. The car fishtailed for a moment, but Jose kept it steady, his fingers white against the wheel. He was running out of road. The empty highway stretched ahead like a dark tunnel, and there was no end in sight. Jose glanced over his shoulder once more. Jed was still there. But as the patrol car's lights flickered behind him, something strange happened. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. The chaos in his mind, the roar of the engine, the shriek of the tires, it all faded into the background. He was suddenly hyper-aware of the situation, as though time itself had stretched out just for him to think clearly. The car swerved again, tires skidding on the damp asphalt. Jose's hands shook as he fought to maintain control. He was exhausted, his body shaking from the tension that had built up. His mind kept replaying the moment when the officer had accused him. The images of the children, the photos that had slipped from his wallet, haunted him. It was all happening too fast. The accusations were too severe, too cruel. But it was more than just the fear of being arrested. It was about the life that had been stolen. The injustice, the weight of a system that never saw him as human first, that always saw him through a lens of suspicion. The world had always been stacked against him. His race, his appearance. Everything about him was used to paint him as a criminal. And now, that same system was coming for him, ready to lock him away. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Jose knew he couldn't stop. Not until the truth was out there. Not until someone believed him. The car surged ahead once more, the tires biting into the asphalt as Jose pushed forward into the unknown. There was no going back now. He had crossed a point of no return. It wasn't just the murder. It wasn't just the accusations. It was the feeling of being cornered, of being trapped in a world that refused to see him as anything other than guilty. And as he sped down the road, the night closing in on him, Jose understood one thing clearly. This was no longer just a pursuit of justice. It was a race for his life. Desperate measures. Jose's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine growling as the car surged forward, its headlights cutting through the inky darkness ahead. The road twisted and turned, but Jose barely noticed. His focus was sharp, his mind racing as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. The looming fear of being caught, of being wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, gnawed at him, making it nearly impossible to think clearly. His heart pounded with every beat, the sound almost deafening in his ears. The moment he had broken free from Officer Jed's grip felt like a lifetime ago, but the images that had flashed before his eyes in that split second, the officer's sneering face, the disbelief in his voice, kept replaying over and over. Jed had been ready to arrest him, to ruin his life, and there was no way Jose could let that happen. He had to get away. He had to disappear. But as he sped through the empty streets, a sinking feeling settled deep in his gut. He knew this couldn't last forever. He was running on borrowed time. The further he drove, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The flashing lights of the patrol car that had followed him were no longer visible in his rearview mirror, but the fear remained. He didn't know how long he could outrun the truth, but every second he gained felt like a victory. And yet, deep down, Jose couldn't shake the feeling that he was racing against more than just the police. He was racing against a system that had never been fair to people like him. From the moment he was born, he had been labeled, categorized, and judged before he even had a chance to prove himself. The color of his skin had always been a barrier, a wall that had kept him out of opportunities, away from fairness, and often right in the crosshairs of injustice. He'd seen it in the way people looked at him on the street, the way they whispered behind his back, the way the police treated him like a suspect rather than a citizen. It didn't matter if he was just trying to make his way in the world, trying to build something for himself. The world didn't care. And now, in the worst way possible, that harsh reality was closing in on him. He was being accused of something unspeakable, something he had no part in. And the worst part, he knew that no matter how hard he tried, the system was always going to find a way to keep him down. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as his mind spiraled further. What if Jed had been right? What if the officer had seen something he hadn't, something that made him a target? What if the photos, the horrifying images of children, the ones he had accidentally dropped in front of the officer, were meant to frame him, to push him into a corner with no way out? He had never seen those photos before, at least not in that context, but the fear that they were connected to him in some way gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The gas light blinked on, the soft chime reminding him that he was running low. Jose's stomach sank. He needed to stop, but the thought of doing so felt like admitting defeat. The gas station, a small one up ahead, was his only option. He couldn't risk running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere, with the police potentially closing in. But even as he approached the station, the dread continued to rise inside him. He didn't know if he was being followed or if he had managed to shake them for good. Either way, this was his only shot. Jose turned sharply into the parking lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. The dimly lit station was nearly empty, the flickering light above the pumps casting long shadows over the abandoned cars that sat in the lot. He pulled up to a pump, his hands shaking as he switched off the engine. The world outside felt surreal, as if he had stepped into a dream where nothing made sense anymore. The tension in his chest was unbearable. There was a pit in his stomach, a nagging sensation that told him this was more than just a routine stop. He looked around cautiously as he stepped out of the car. The parking lot was silent except for the soft hum of the neon lights and the distant hum of wind. It felt as though the whole world had gone to sleep, leaving him alone with his thoughts and fears. He was acutely aware of the gas pump in his hand, the nozzle slipping into the tank with a soft click. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the flash of red and blue to appear behind him. His mind was racing, and every time he tried to focus, the images of the photos, the accusation, and the officer's mocking voice swirled in his head, making it impossible to think clearly. He wasn't guilty. He had done nothing wrong. But the world was already painting him as something he wasn't. He could feel it closing in, a trap tightening around him that no amount of running could escape. The sound of footsteps caught his attention. He turned quickly, only to see a man in a dark jacket walking toward the store. He didn't recognize him, but the stranger's gaze lingered on Jose for just a moment too long, his eyes scanning the area before moving on. Jose couldn't help but feel the weight of that look. Was he being watched? Was he drawing too much attention to himself? It was impossible to tell, but the sense of paranoia continued to rise. The gas tank was full now. Jose twisted the nozzle off and replaced it, his movements quick and efficient, but his mind was far from settled. He needed to get out of there. He couldn't stay, not when everything felt like it was falling apart around him. But before he could get back in the car, something caught his eye. The small TV above the cashier's counter was flashing, and the words that appeared across the screen made his blood run cold. Breaking NEWS. Local man wanted for multiple charges, including child exploitation and kidnapping. Jose froze. His own face appeared on the screen, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. The camera zoomed in on him, catching every detail, every angle of his face. The weight of the accusation, the very thing he had been trying to outrun, was now staring back at him through the glow of the screen. His heart leaped in his throat as the announcer's voice filled the small gas station. Jose Miller, 28, is wanted in connection with disturbing photos discovered in his possession. Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tilt as the room spun. He stumbled back, almost dropping the bag of food he had grabbed earlier. The cashier's eyes flicked nervously to him, then quickly dropped back to the register. There was no mistaking it. They knew. The world knew, and it had already made up its mind. Jose's breath hitched as his stomach turned to ice. His hands felt clammy as he fumbled for his wallet to pay, the crumpled bills slipping through his fingers as his vision blurred. He tossed them onto the counter without another word, his legs shaking beneath him as he turned and bolted out the door. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but he barely registered it. His mind was screaming, every thought a blur of panic. His chest tightened with the weight of the accusation hanging over him. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. All he could do was run. The car was still parked by the pump, but it felt like miles away now. Jose's legs moved on their own, carrying him back toward the vehicle as his mind raced with one singular thought. Get out of here. Get out before they find you. The neon lights of the gas station faded behind him, swallowed by the darkness as he jumped into the car and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life as he sped off, the tires screeching once more as he tore down the road. He wasn't sure where he was going. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. But one thing was certain. Jose Miller was no longer just running from the police. He was running from a world that had already convicted him. And there was no escaping that truth. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, and as Jose sped into the night, he knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The pursuit of truth. Jose's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, the rough texture of the leather offering little comfort against the cold sweat that covered his palms. His thoughts, a chaotic mix of panic and desperation, twisted inside his mind like a storm, the images of the accusation on the news flashing behind his eyes. The TV screen, the words scrolling below his face. It was as if the world had branded him before he could even open his mouth. But the truth, the reality of what he had witnessed, was far different than the lie that was now being told. The gas station was now a blur in his rearview mirror, the faint lights fading as he sped away, the engine whining with each press of the accelerator. His heart was still racing, the blood pounding in his ears like a drum. Jose didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. He was tired, his body aching from the strain of the night. But there was no time to rest, no time to think, except for the single thought that consumed him. I need to clear my name. The accusation hanging over his head was the worst thing he had ever faced, worse than the daily prejudice, worse than the judgment he had grown up with, because now he was being painted as something he wasn't, a criminal, a child predator. And no matter how much he wanted to deny it, no matter how much he wanted to scream, the world wasn't going to listen to him. Not now. Not when the evidence, those photos, were out there. He could feel the weight of them, pressing against him, making every step feel heavier than the last. But Jose knew something the world didn't. He was innocent. He wasn't part of whatever sick conspiracy was at play, whatever twisted trap had been set for him. The photos, those horrifying images, had nothing to do with him. He hadn't even seen them before that moment with Officer Jed. Someone had planted them, someone who was framing him for something he had no part in. But who? Who would do this? Why him? The question spun around in his mind, unanswered and relentless. He couldn't help but feel as if someone somewhere had been watching him. Someone had been pulling the strings, setting everything in motion from the very beginning. The murder he had witnessed wasn't an isolated event. It was part of something bigger, something dark, something dangerous. Jose couldn't understand it all, but one thing was clear. He had to find out the truth. He had to clear his name. The police, especially Officer Jed, were never going to listen to him, not after what they saw on the news. If he was going to survive this, if he was going to make sure the right person paid for what had happened, he had to find the answers himself. The road ahead stretched endlessly, dark and desolate. But in the distance, the faint glow of a city could be seen on the horizon. It was his only option. He needed information, a lead, something to point him in the right direction. It had been too long since he'd been in the city, but he knew it well enough. The labyrinth of alleys, the back streets, the corners where people with information gathered. It was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover it. Jose had been to the city enough times to know that it wasn't always the safest place to be, but it was where the answers were. It was where people spoke, where rumors spread, where the truth could be found, even if it was buried beneath layers of lies. His mind wandered back to the murder he had witnessed. The man had been so cold, so deliberate in his actions. It had been a planned execution, not an impulse. Jose's stomach churned as he recalled the expression on the man's face, calm, detached, almost as if he were doing something mundane. It wasn't the face of someone who had lost control. It was the face of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and Jose knew that meant the man wasn't acting alone. The idea that this was bigger than just one person, bigger than just one crime, planted a seed in Jose's mind. This wasn't just about a murder. This was a part of something more dangerous, more insidious, and it was beginning to feel as though he had been dragged into the middle of it. As his car roared through the night, the lights of the city grew brighter on the horizon. The streets of the city were coming to him, calling him forward, pulling him in with the promise of answers. He didn't know what he would find there, but he had no other choice. The darkness of the night pressed down on him, making him feel small, alone, as if the weight of the world was collapsing onto his shoulders. But deep inside, there was a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone, not yet. The truth had to be out there, somewhere. When he finally arrived, the city felt alive and chaotic, a stark contrast to the eerie quiet he had left behind. The hum of neon signs and the constant flow of traffic surrounded him as he navigated through the busy streets. Jose parked the car in a secluded alleyway, well hidden from any potential prying eyes. The last thing he needed was for someone to spot him and raise the alarm. The authorities would be looking for him. They would be hunting him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he exited the car and looked around. The alley was empty for the moment, the shadows hiding the secrets of the night. But as he walked toward the dimly lit street corner, his eyes scanned every figure, every movement. He didn't know who to trust, not anymore. The city, in all its sprawling, noisy chaos, had always been a place of refuge for him. But now, with the weight of his situation pressing on him, it felt more like a jungle, a dangerous place where predators lurked in the shadows, waiting for their prey. He rounded the corner, keeping his pace steady and cautious, eyes flicking to the darkened doorways where people loitered. A few whispers reached his ears as he passed, but nothing that stood out. The city had always been full of rumors, full of talk. But Jose wasn't here for idle chatter. He was here for something more important, something that could save his life. As he walked deeper into the heart of the city, he remembered the faces of those who might have answers. There was Jamar, a guy who knew the streets and the underground world of the city better than anyone. And then there was Nina, a reporter he had run into a few times, someone who had always been keen to dig into the stories that the authorities would rather keep hidden. Both of them were known for their connections, for having ears in places where the rest of the world couldn't reach. Jose's mind raced as he recalled the last time he had spoken to Nina. She had been following a story about a string of missing children, a story that hadn't been making headlines, but one that had been whispered about in hushed voices. At the time, Jose hadn't thought much of it, but now, with the weight of the accusations against him and the pictures he had seen, he wondered if there was a connection. His thoughts were interrupted when he reached a familiar spot, an old diner tucked in between two buildings, its neon sign flickering dimly in the distance. It was a place where the city's outcasts, the ones who lived in the shadows, often gathered. It was the perfect spot to find someone like Jamar or Nina. He pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming softly. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the murmur of quiet conversations. The smell of stale coffee and grease hung in the air as Jose scanned the room. A few regulars sat at the counter, nursing their drinks, their faces a mix of disinterest and curiosity. It was the kind of place where no one cared about your business, unless you made it theirs. Jose took a seat at the counter, his eyes darting around the room. He wasn't sure how to begin or who to trust, but he knew one thing. If he was going to uncover the truth, he had to start somewhere. The truth, the answers, had to be here, in the heart of the city's shadows. And Jose was ready to face whatever lay ahead, whatever it took to clear his name and expose the forces at work behind the scenes. As the waitress approached, Jose took a deep breath and prepared himself for the conversation that could change everything. The shadows grip. The waitress moved toward him with a tired, mechanical stride. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of late nights and endless shifts. Her name tag read Mara, and when she finally reached the counter, she gave him a cursory glance before asking, "What'll it be?" Jose paused, his mind reeling. He didn't know exactly how to start, how to ask for help when he wasn't even sure who to trust. But he had to make the first move. He had to take the chance, no matter how small. "A coffee," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm looking for someone." Mara gave him a nod, her eyes scanning the room as if she were waiting his words. "Ain't nobody here for you to talk to unless you're looking to waste your time. I'm the only one who works this shift." Her voice was low and flat, as though it had been dulled by years of the same empty routine. He knew she was right. The faces around him were familiar enough, strangers who came and went without leaving a trace. But something in the air told him this diner held more than just coffee and late-night meals. It held secrets. It was a place where people like him came when they needed answers, even if they didn't know it. The waitress turned to grab his coffee, and as she did, Jose's eyes wandered over the room, landing on a figure seated in the far corner. A man with a hood pulled low over his face, his body hunched over, as if trying to remain inconspicuous. But Jose knew the type, quiet, watchful, not here by accident. This was someone who had information. His gut told him to go for it, to walk across the room and talk to the man. But every inch of his being screamed at him to play it safe, to remain in the shadows, to wait for the perfect moment. Yet the time for waiting was long gone. Every second now felt like an eternity. Mara returned with his coffee, setting it down in front of him with a clink of the cup against the counter. "You might want to keep your distance from him," she muttered quietly, leaning in closer. "Guy's a piece of work. Been coming here for years, never says much. But I can tell he knows things." She glanced at the man in the corner before lowering her voice even more. "You sure you want to mess with him?" Jose nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I need to find out something. He might know something I need." Mara studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as though she understood the gravity of the situation. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. People like him don't talk for free." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jose to contemplate his next move. He knew that walking over to the man was a risk. But in a place like this, risks were the only way to get the answers he so desperately needed. His fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, its warmth grounding him for a moment as he steeled himself. The man in the corner didn't move, didn't look up. He was as still as the shadows that surrounded him. His posture hunched as though trying to remain as invisible as possible. But Jose could feel the pull, the sense that something vital was hidden in that corner. He could almost taste it, an undercurrent of something darker than the diner's faded booths and neon signs. He stood up, his legs stiff as he walked over, his footsteps heavy in the silence. The closer he got, the more the man's features became clear. A middle-aged figure, weathered by life, with graying hair poking out from under the hood. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who had learned the art of remaining unnoticed. Jose stopped a few feet from the table, his voice hesitant as he spoke. "I hear you know things. Things about what's going on." The man didn't respond at first. He didn't even move. Jose was about to turn and leave when the man finally raised his head, his eyes sharp and calculating, though wary. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, his voice hoarse, as if it had been a while since he'd used it. His eyes flicked around the room, then back to Jose. What makes you think you can handle it? Jose swallowed hard, trying to quell the wave of anxiety rising in his chest. He knew the risks, but they were nothing compared to what would happen if he let fear rule him now. I'm not looking for trouble, just answers. The man's lips twitched into a dry, humorless smile. Nobody's looking for trouble, kid, but trouble finds him anyway. Jose leaned in, keeping his voice low. I'm being framed for something I didn't do. I need to know who's behind it. I need to know what's really happening. For a moment, the man just stared at him, his eyes boring into Jose's with a strange intensity. It felt like an eternity, as though he was measuring Jose's soul, deciding if he was worth the risk. Finally, the man spoke, his voice soft, but filled with an edge of warning. You're tangled up in something much bigger than you think. You want to know who's behind it. You're looking at him. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But it's not what you think. It's not just one person, one villain pulling the strings. It's a network. A system, all the way to the top. And you're caught in the middle. Jose felt his heart drop into his stomach. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't just about the photos. This was something deeper, more systematic. Something planned. He leaned in closer. I need names. I need proof. I don't care how dangerous it is. Tell me what you know. The man's face darkened. He looked over Jose's shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. You'll find what you need in there, but don't say I didn't warn you. He paused, his voice lowering to a whisper. There's more going on than you realize. More people involved. The deeper you go, the more you'll lose. And trust me, they won't stop until they bury you. Jose didn't hesitate. He grabbed the envelope, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the paper inside. The contents weren't much, just a few names scribbled in a hasty, shaky handwriting. But at the bottom of the list, one name stood out to him like a beacon in the dark. Walter Grant. Jose's pulse quickened. He knew that name. Walter Grant was a high-ranking official in the city, someone who had always been well-placed in local politics. He was a man with power, connections, everything Jose would need to bring the truth to light. But Jose also knew that getting close to Grant was no easy feat. The man was untouchable. His influence spread across every corner of the city. The man in the corner didn't wait for Jose to speak. He stood up abruptly, his movements quick and fluid, like he was trying to disappear into the shadows once more. You're on your own from here. But remember, once you dig too deep, you might not make it back out. This isn't something you can walk away from. It's a war, and you're in the middle of it. With those final words, the man turned and melted into the crowd, vanishing as easily as he had appeared. Jose was left standing there, the weight of the envelope in his hands, the names written on the paper burning into his mind. There was no turning back now. He had the answers he needed. But now, Jose had to decide what to do with them. The truth had revealed itself, but the cost of uncovering it would be far higher than he had ever imagined. The deeper he went, the more he would lose. But Jose knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about bringing down a system built on lies, corruption, and deceit. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to stop until the truth was out. The unraveling. The envelope felt heavier in Jose's hands than it should have, its contents now burning a path of clarity in his mind. He could see it all in front of him. Names, connections, a shadowy network that spanned far beyond what he had ever expected. The pieces of a puzzle, each one part of something far darker than he could have imagined. And yet the answers were just out of reach. Walter Grant, the name that stood out on the list, was more than just a politician or an official. He was a puppet master, pulling strings from behind a curtain of the city's most powerful institutions. But the more Jose thought about it, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on him. What kind of system was he up against? What kind of danger was he walking into? The man in the corner at the diner had warned him. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was a war. A war between those who sought control and those who tried to expose it. Jose sat in the dimly lit booth of the diner, the faces around him a blur as he stared at the names scribbled on the paper. He could hear the soft murmur of conversations, the clink of cups, the low hum of the neon lights buzzing above. The world outside felt so far away, yet so close. Each moment he spent here, each passing second, felt like it was driving him deeper into the rabbit hole. He had no time to lose. If the man in the corner was right, things were already spiraling out of control, and the longer he stayed idle, the more people would be caught in the web of lies and corruption. People like him. People who didn't have a voice in this world. His mind raced as he scanned the names in the envelope again. Walter Grant. The more he thought about it, the more his gut told him that this was the key. Grant wasn't just a figurehead. He was the key to everything. He was connected to everything happening in the city. But how could Jose get close to him? How could he expose the man without drawing the attention of everyone who would do anything to protect him? It wasn't long before he decided that he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. He needed someone who had the resources, the connections, and the skills to get him the information he needed. There was one person he could think of. Nina. Nina was a reporter, someone who had spent years trying to uncover the city's darkest secrets. She had a reputation for digging deep, for never letting go once she latched onto a story. The last time they had spoken, she had been investigating the disappearances of several children, a story that seemed to tie into the dark network Jose was now tangled in. If anyone could help him expose Grant and the people behind the operation, it was Nina. Jose didn't hesitate. He knew where to find her. He had seen her at local rallies, at protests where she had covered the stories that no one else dared to touch. She was fearless, and that's exactly what he needed. He grabbed the envelope and shoved it into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the names once more before he stood up and walked out of the diner. The night air outside was cold, biting at his skin as he pulled his jacket tighter around him. He didn't have a car anymore. It had been abandoned somewhere on the outskirts of town, a casualty of his frantic flight from the police. He didn't need it anyway, not in this part of the city, where every corner had a memory, every street had a connection. He knew where he had to go, where Nina would be, even if she didn't know he was coming. It didn't take long to find her. The neon glow of the city seemed to beckon him, guiding him through the maze of streets until he reached the rundown building she often used as a base. It was an old warehouse tucked away in an industrial part of the city, far from the glitzy lights of downtown but full of life nonetheless. The kind of place where journalists and activists gathered to talk, to share their findings, to plan their next move. Jose stepped up to the door, knocking 3 times in quick succession. The door creaked open, and Nina appeared, her face briefly illuminated by the soft light inside. Her sharp eyes met his, recognition flashing across her features. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let him in. She didn't need to ask questions. She knew he wouldn't be here unless something serious had happened. "Come in," she said, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jose stepped inside, feeling the tension in his chest begin to loosen just a little. Nina had always been good at cutting through the noise, at seeing the truth even when it was buried deep. But tonight, the truth felt like a monstrous thing, far bigger than either of them could have ever expected. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair near a small desk cluttered with papers, laptops, and coffee cups. She moved around to the other side of the desk and sat, her eyes never leaving him. "You're looking for answers, right?" Jose nodded, his hand brushing against the envelope in his jacket. "I'm in the middle of something. I don't know how deep it goes yet, but it's big, bigger than I thought." Nina raised an eyebrow, the same look she always gave when she thought someone was holding back. "I'm guessing you didn't just come to tell me about your bad day." "Jose, what's really going on?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope, placing it on the desk between them. Nina's gaze flickered to it before she reached out, her fingers brushing over the paper inside. As she read the names, her face hardened. The moment she saw Walter Grant's name, her expression shifted from curiosity to wariness. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice low. "I met someone. A guy in a diner. He said Grant is behind everything. The disappearances, the cover-ups. He said it's all connected." Jose's voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had been building up. "I need your help, Nina. I can't do this alone. I can't trust anyone in the system. But you know how to dig, how to expose the truth." Nina leaned back in her chair, her eyes flickering over the paper once more. "This is big, Jose. This isn't something you can just brush off. You know that, right? If you go after Grant, you're not just going up against a politician. You're going up against the whole damn city." Jose nodded grimly. "I know, but I didn't ask for any of this. I'm just trying to clear my name. The police, they've got nothing on me, but they're framing me anyway. And if I don't stop this, more people are going to get hurt." Nina stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Then slowly she nodded. "All right. We'll do this. But you're right, Jose. This isn't just about you anymore. We're talking about a system that has its claws in everything. And if you're going to bring it down, you'll need to be prepared for what comes next." Jose swallowed hard. What comes next? Nina's eyes locked onto his with a mixture of resolve and caution. The fight of your life. And there's no turning back after this. She stood up, walking over to a nearby bookshelf and pulling out a file, a thick manila folder stuffed with papers. She dropped it on the table with a heavy thud. "This is what I've been working on for the last few months. I knew something was off with Grant, but this..." Her voice trailed off as she flicked through the pages. "It's bigger than I ever imagined." Jose took the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was full of names, addresses, dates, and cryptic notes. His heart raced as he scanned through the pages. This was the proof he needed. This was the key to unraveling everything. Together, they would go after Grant. Together, they would expose the truth. And Jose knew that there was no turning back now. The city that had turned its back on him would soon know the truth, and they would learn just how far the corruption ran. The gathering storm. The file Nina had handed over felt heavier with each passing moment. As Jose leafed through the pages, his eyes quickly scanned the names, the addresses, the dates. He could feel the weight of the secrets hidden within those sheets of paper, the culmination of years of deception, the hidden layers of corruption, and the ruthless power that Walter Grant and his network had amassed. Every name in the file was a breadcrumb, leading him closer to the heart of the labyrinth. But with every new revelation, a deeper fear gnawed at him. This wasn't just a few crooked officials. This wasn't some minor conspiracy hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. This was an entire system, one that reached deep into the veins of the city, pulling the strings behind everything. Jose's head spun as he processed the implications. If Grant was at the center of this, then the people pulling the strings were the ones who controlled everything. Politics, business, law enforcement, the city itself. The dim light in Nina's office did little to comfort him as he absorbed the gravity of the file. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thickening with every revelation. But there was no going back now. He had seen too much, learned too much. The truth had its claws in him, and there was no way to escape. Not until it was exposed, until the web of lies was torn apart. Nina stood by the window, arms crossed, her gaze lost in the world outside. "You know this isn't going to be easy," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Grant's got more power than you realize. He's got connections everywhere, people who will do anything to protect him." Jose didn't take his eyes off the file. His fingers traced over the names, his mind working furiously, piecing the puzzle together. "I don't care how powerful he is," he said, his voice steely. "This isn't just about me anymore. This is about the truth. It's about everything he's done. all the lives ruined. If we don't stop him, this cycle will never end. Nina nodded, her expression a mix of worry and determination. She had seen the depths of corruption before, but something in Jose's words made her realize just how far this one went. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the papers in front of him. "I've been investigating Grant for months," she said softly. "But I've only scratched the surface. Every lead I've followed has been buried under layers of manipulation, cover-ups, and threats. Every time I get close, something happens." Jose looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nina continued, her voice barely a whisper, "people start disappearing. My sources go silent. My emails get intercepted. The deeper I go, the more dangerous it gets. It's like they're watching me, always one step ahead." A chill ran down Jose's spine. "So why keep going?" Nina met his gaze. "Because someone has to. And you're right. If we don't expose this now, it'll only keep getting worse. People are suffering, and it's all because of him. Because of the system he built." She paused, her gaze shifting to the file on the table. "But you need to understand, Jose, we can't just take this to the authorities. They're in on it. The police, the politicians, the judges, they're all part of it. If we're going to take down Grant, we need a different plan. We need a way to hit him where it hurts, without letting them know we're coming." Jose nodded, a plan starting to form in his mind. He had been running for too long, terrified of being caught in the web of lies and false accusations. But now he realized that fear was just a weapon they had used against him. If he was going to survive, if he was going to expose the truth, he needed to think like they did. He needed to be a step ahead, just like they always were. "I think I have an idea," he said slowly, his voice low with resolve. "We start small. We gather evidence. People are scared. But if we can find those who are willing to talk, those who know what's really going on, then maybe we can expose Grant before he can silence everyone." Nina studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then finally she nodded. "You're right. We can't just go after Grant directly. Not yet. We need to expose his network. We need to show everyone how deep this goes. We start by digging into his connections, his businesses, his allies, anyone who might have a motive to protect him." The air between them thickened as they both realized the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Jose had thought he was just trying to clear his name. But now, as the pieces fell into place, he understood that this was more than just about him. This was about everything they had fought against, the system that had kept people like him down, the lies that had perpetuated the injustices, and the corrupt men who profited from the suffering of others. "We'll need help," Nina said, breaking the silence. "We'll need a team. People who can dig into Grant's financial records, track down witnesses, and leak information to the right sources. We can't do this alone." Jose's eyes narrowed as he thought of the few people he knew who might be able to help. "I know a few people. People who owe me favors. I'll reach out. But this won't be easy. If we're going to do this, we need to be careful. One wrong move, and it's over." Nina agreed. "We'll have to move quietly. No one can know what we're doing. The moment they find out, we'll be dead." Jose stood up, the weight of the task ahead of him settling like a heavy stone in his chest. "Then let's get started." Over the next few days, Jose and Nina worked tirelessly, reaching out to their contacts, gathering information, and setting the stage for their plan. They knew it would be dangerous, but there was no turning back. Each step forward brought them closer to exposing Grant, but it also brought them closer to the abyss. Nina's contacts were invaluable. She had a network of journalists, activists, and former law enforcement officers who had been ostracized or silenced because they had dared to speak out against the corruption that ran through the city's veins. Together, they started piecing together the extent of Grant's influence. It was clear that Grant wasn't just some corrupt politician. He was the head of an empire built on exploitation. His tentacles reached into every corner of the city, real estate deals, construction contracts, black market operations, and even more sinister dealings involving human trafficking. The list of victims was long, and as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became evident that Grant's empire wasn't just limited to this city. It spread across state lines, touching places Jose had never even imagined. Jose's own role in this was becoming clearer too. His eyewitness account of the murder had connected him to a much larger scheme, a scheme that Grant had orchestrated for years. The more Jose uncovered, the more he realized just how entangled he was in this web. It wasn't just about being framed for a crime. It was about being used as a pawn in a much bigger game. And the more they dug, the more Jose realized that the lives of the people who had crossed Grant were worth nothing to him. They were just casualties in his quest for power. As the information mounted, so did the risks. Jose could feel the heat intensifying, the pressure of time running out. He could sense that Grant was beginning to take notice of the movements around him. The walls were closing in, but they couldn't stop now. They had to keep going. "We're getting closer," Nina said one night as they pored over the files. "But they're starting to get nervous. We've hit a nerve." Jose nodded grimly, his fingers tapping on the desk. "Let's keep pushing. We've come too far to stop now." But deep down, he knew that whatever was coming next would be the hardest battle of his life. They weren't just fighting to expose Grant anymore. They were fighting for their very survival.